Cool. Hey, everyone. Thanks for turning up, either for a comfy seat or to actually listen about this, but appreciate it either way. So for the next 26 minutes, I'll be talking about just something that I started at the very beginning of this year. If you think about like January the 1st to March the 31st, it's exactly 90 days. But really the premise of this was to fill in a lot of gaps from an education point of view that I had. And I think it's like if you all heard the keynote today, there's a lot of focus around developers, DevOps, developers in general, that term consists of a lot of different front-end, back-end developers, database administrators, and DevOps engineers, if we're going to use the quoted term there. So I wanted to put something together, learning in public, about all of the various different ways, tooling, process, principles of DevOps, put it into a repository, share it in public, learn in public, basically, was the premise of that. So, and there's a lot of slides, but a lot of them do have memes and stuff like this. So basically, we've got probably 25 minutes now to cover 90 days worth of topics. So what we're going to get into, the QR code, how many people have seen this repository, the GitHub repository, 90 Days of DevOps? Okay, so a couple of you, cool. But basically what this is, well, it started out as a bit of a note-taking exercise for me and just pushing that into a GitHub repo and learning in public. And then suddenly there's about 17,000 stars and it's getting a lot of noise in the community. And really the focus of it was to get a better foundational knowledge around some of the principles, the processes and the tooling around DevOps. So to begin with, I'm Michael Cade, so I work at Veeam, and probably about 18 months ago, I shouldn't say pushed, I got moved into the acquisition of Kasten. So Kasten K10 is focused on Kubernetes backup, and in doing so, I was definitely talking to a lot more of that DevOps persona, that developer persona, and it felt like huge imposter syndrome at that point, and having to learn a lot more around things like CI/CD and infrastructure as code. Even though I'd touched a lot of that fundamental before, it was new, and I wanted to make sure that I could share that as a process, whether it was just notes and if it helped one person. That's been my ethos around creating content in the community. If it helps one person, it's worth doing. If there are any questions, you'll find me on the Twitterverse as well. And from a community point of view, that I feel like that comes first for me. As much as Veeam pay my wages, I feel like there's a huge, not only do you learn a lot from community members, but I feel like it's a lot of giving back as well. Like if you can write or you can create content that's going to help at least one person, it's worth doing. So why? Role change and the focus for me. So Kubernetes backup, as much as I haven't moved companies, I still look at backup and recovery and all the things that go with data management. And even from a DevOps point of view, I'd already touched on a lot of things around infrastructure as code, configuration management, with tools like Terraform and Ansible. So I had existing knowledge, and as well, I'm going to cover stuff about like Linux from an operating system point of view and some of the foundation that you need to know there as well. So I had a lot of existing knowledge, but a lot of gaps as well. And I think it's a fair comment that a lot of us in the room, a lot of us at this whole event are going to have a lot of gaps when it comes to that automation and some of the stuff that they were saying on stage this morning. So what's already out there? So obviously I don't want to go and copy, even though that's sometimes a great way of putting your perspective out there as well. There's a lot of free and there's a lot of paid content. I also found this 100 days of Kubernetes, 100 days of cloud, 100 days of blah, blah, blah. And 100 days, my brain cannot compute for 100 days on the same topic. I had to break things down. And when we get through it, you're going to see that basically 90 days, you split that down into 12 different topics over 7 days. It's a little bit more achievable. So 7 days of Linux, 7 days of a programming language. It starts to become a little bit more achievable as you're going through it. I think also like Udemy is a great platform. I think how many people has their Udemy account looking a bit like this, where it says 0%. Some great courses on there, but they cost money. There's always a sale. Mine looks very much like that, not a lot of completion. So I wanted to go and use free and open source, or at least free content out there on YouTube. And throughout the whole repository, there's a lot of, so as much as there's a lot of notes, there's a lot of why, there's also a lot of hands-on. Like I'm creating something, I'm creating Terraform code, I'm creating Ansible playbooks, I'm building a Linux box and pushing some applications to that and getting a better understanding, that foundational knowledge, sharing that. And so far, like I've had a lot of people in the community give feedback on some of those exercises as a useful way of being able to get hands-on and learn those processes. And I think DevOps itself, like we've kind of muddied the water out since around 2009 when the term started to be focused on. But really, if we think about, like, we've got DevOps engineers. How many people are a DevOps engineer in here? Okay, cool. But like, so from a DevOps perspective, it's more around the process and the principle versus what you do on a daily basis, right? Like a cloud engineer, a systems administrator should absolutely start adopting and thinking about what DevOps is and how it can automate a lot of those tasks out of your day-to-day. So really what the focus was to begin with was go high level, start looking at the process, the principles, and then some of the tooling was really the main focus around that. And then the key part to it, as I've mentioned more, is around sharing that journey out there to the community. So I've been at Veeam for 7.5 years. I've been in the community pretty much since day one of my IT career, so around 15, 16 years. And it's always been about blogging, or it's been about talking, it's been about sharing and learning in public, as well as sharing that story at meetups or speaking at events like this. I think it also feels like a massive hurdle or a steep learning curve when we have to learn something new. And I'm sure we've all been through that, whether it was virtualization, whether it was cloud, whether it was we were Exchange admins and we had to start learning something else. There's always that daunting, whether it's imposter syndrome or whether it's that there's a huge mountain and I have no idea what that even means, how to even spell it. And I think you have to get into your head, we'll never be done learning. We're going to, this continuation of change is constant. Writing blogs, tutorials, cheat sheets, there's some amazing cheat sheets, not as in brain dumps for exams, but as in single pages that you can go and look at on social media, on LinkedIn, and see some of those like quick reference guides. I think that's probably a better term for it. Speaking and sharing like this journey to make it like it's okay not to know everything, and it's fine that we need to go and hunt ourselves to get that knowledge. Answering things on different community forums, and then because not everyone's into that writing content, I feel like YouTube over the last 2 years, I've become massively addicted to YouTube content over the pandemic because it's an easy click it on, watch it continuously, and you're generally going to pick something up pretty quick. And there is so much, and I would generally say that throughout this whole repository, on the bottom of every day, so there's 90 days of content. On the bottom of that is where the smart people that I've learned from, I've linked to their content, and I've just consolidated that down into let's say an 800 to 1,000 word blog type thing. So where do we start? So to begin with, this is just a handful of logos that you might come across when you start thinking about the process, the principles, and the tooling that come along with that automation. We've got infrastructure as code here, configuration management, we've got Git and Git-based services, we've got observability, monitoring, reporting, we've got programming language. Like, where do you start? And I think this basically sums things up, right? It looks very overwhelming to get into that world, especially if you're a vSphere admin. We're constantly learning the VMware stack as well. So not only is it this, we've also got to continue doing what our day job is, as well as learning all of those new areas or some of those areas, because I think that's important. Just because I've picked 12 items and 12 different areas, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to need all of those. And I think that's also an important characteristic of why I did it. So how do I learn best? And each one of you are going to be different, but I watch a hell of a lot of video content. I write down a lot of the notes that I then obviously make sure that they make sense, and then publish that out into the community, into the wild. And I chose to kind of eat my own dog food and kind of get to know some of those fundamental Git commands by leveraging GitHub as a repository versus like my WordPress site or something like that. Because having that version control, one, allowed other people in the community to start contributing against that and give their perspective as well. It also allows people to go and fork that repository so that they can go and share their journey as well. So that was kind of the overarching theme to that. Now, instead of that image that you just saw with various different logos everywhere, I also broke that down, and I first did this in a blog post, and I put it onto Kasten.io. And you first start with, well, before we get into any of the cool stuff, as it were, we need to understand, well, what is and why do we use DevOps? Or we start thinking about platform engineering. But for now, let's just think about DevOps why. What is the role of a DevOps engineer? And I'll use that, the air quotes there, because again, I think cloud engineers, cloud admins, infrastructure admins, systems administrators, they're all, eventually we're all gonna have to know an element of one of these areas, if not a load more as well. Then I kind of walked around is learn a programming language. Not for everyone, but in my role, I was going into this cloud native world, looking after Kubernetes backup in terms of Kasten, and a lot of open source projects as well. Now, generally speaking, in the cloud native ecosystem, a lot of the programs there, and as well as a lot of programs in the cloud native world, a lot is written in Golang or Python. That's generally the two programming languages that we see. And because Kasten K10 is written in Go, and some of the open source projects are as well, I actually wanted to know a little bit more of what does that mean? What does that code mean? So selfishly, I chose Go, and then I got a lot of feedback around, well, Python actually would be maybe a jack of all trades when it comes to all other areas of DevOps, whether it be things like networking or other areas. Linux, and I think Linux, we're probably, half of us would put our hand up slightly if we were to say, yeah, we know Linux, we use it every day. So we're on to a good start. Same with networking, right? We know it's always DNS that causes any problems, DHCP, etc. Just know the fundamental, the OSI layer and stuff like that. So I walked through each of these and spent 7 days on each of them, getting hands-on, as well as putting some theory behind it. I said about sticking to one cloud provider. So I went out to Twitter and asked the social world, well, what one should I cover? Should it be Azure? Should it be Google? Should it be AWS? And Azure won the race only just against AWS. But I feel like if you have to go and learn all three public clouds, that becomes hugely overwhelming and massively confusing. Whereas if you go and just look after the foundational knowledge of Azure, you can take that to AWS, you could take that to Google, you could take that to Oracle, you could take it to any cloud basically, because you're going to have the fundamental and the foundational services that you see there. Then we start to get into maybe a little bit more around that automation piece about using Git effectively and using Git-based services. And this goes back to eating my own dog food whilst hosting everything on GitHub in a GitHub repository. Then containers, Kubernetes. Now, equally, if we think about the platform being whether it's virtualization, whether it's being containers, whether it be in Kubernetes, I chose Kubernetes given that I wanted to get a little bit more of a foundational knowledge around Kubernetes. Now, I'd already spent 12 months kind of at the hose part, at the fire hydrant, learning a lot more about Kubernetes anyway. So spending 7 days is not going to be enough to have a good foundational knowledge of Kubernetes. But it would definitely go into the high-level overview of what it is, how it looks. And it also uses some comparisons there around what Kubernetes looks like for the vSphere admin as well, because that's obviously where I've come from as well. Then we get into learning infrastructure as code. Again, I have the background there around deploying virtual machines, both on vSphere, but also in the public cloud. So I had that and then brought that into having a better understanding of that infrastructure as code, namely using Terraform around that. Configuration management, how do we make sure that the application is in a desired state from day 1 to day 30 and onwards? And I chose Red Hat Ansible. What you're going to see as well throughout all of this is all of the tools that I'm using are all either a community edition or they're going to be a free and open source tool, because I want to make it so that everyone can follow along. Even the Azure is using the free tier of Microsoft Azure from a cloud point of view. So you can pick up all of these and still walk through the hands-on labs that I've kind of put in place. CI/CD pipelines, I actually touch on a few different areas here. Jenkins is probably the OG from a CI/CD pipeline, but I also touch on things like Argo CD and GitHub Actions in there. Then observability, and I've kind of put it into the order that you probably think about things as well here. So observability, we want to look at monitoring, metrics, logging, tracing, etc. And then it's all about backup. Backup's generally at the bottom of the list, so I put it at the bottom of the list for us here, even though I work for a backup company. But in there, I started talking about some of the specific data services. Think about databases. It's you don't just have SQL to look after. There's lots of different data services available to us to store so much different data. And then that brings us round. So that's kind of breaking it down into those smaller chunks was really the key area to that. And that blog post kind of was sat there in the back of my head. And then on New Year's Eve, as you do, it's like, oh, I should do something more with that, actually. We should start tomorrow for 90 days and just write all of this 110,000 word like challenge and put it all out there. So what I want to do for the remainder is kind of touch on those in a very short time span and go through some of those 12 or 13 different topic areas, and just like basically hit the top of each one. So if we think about the responsibilities of the DevOps engineer, and again, I'll use those air quotes because this is anyone that is going to adopt those processes and principles, is the link between the developer and the platform or the operations team. How do we incorporate that? And I think it was, I think Kelsey mentioned it in the keynote as well about a lot of us, or a lot of our customers, if you're a partner, will not be software developers. Like, we're not creating software. We generally buy our software off the shelf and we provision virtual machines on premises, in the cloud, to run that binary, that application. We scale that up, we do what we need to do for that customer. From a DevOps point of view, we need to be able to think about how that looks from a CD point of view. So how does that look from a continuous delivery point of view? How does that, so as much as you might not have this side, we still have to think about that as a process. How do we plan the upgrade from Microsoft SQL version X to version Y and so on? So we still need to think about that and think about that automation. Applications are going to be released a lot faster. Given the nature of cloud native, we're going to not have a year release or 6-month release. We're going to see everything like 2 weeks or a month release cycle. So we have to think about how we automate a lot of that deployment and then that upgrades, and start thinking about that application focus. Again, it's like I kind of knew what they were going to talk about in the keynote. I didn't, but everything starts with the application and not necessarily at the machine anymore. Like, we're going up a stack, and I think VMware have been talking about that for a while as well. So this kind of goes into the DevOps lifecycle, but if you think about continuous everything, we want to automate continuous everything, but also automate everything. DevOps won't be creating the app, so we don't have to go and learn a programming language to necessarily go and start developing applications. The idea there was, I want to be able to read it, or I want to be able to develop a tool that allows me to get from A to B quicker. So we might be taking off the shelf. So this might be already eradicated from our process. We have to think about deployment, and we have to think about monitoring, and then the continuation of that. How do we keep on updating the deployment, and how do we then continue the monitoring, getting feedback from that, and then keeping the system going in an automated fashion? So some of the ideas down there. If we think about that, learning a programming language, do we need to learn it? No, absolutely. The reason why, in the end, it kind of looks like the whole repository is very modular, in that maybe on day 7, I think it is, where I start the programming language. If you don't want to, just skip it. You don't need, it doesn't. If you don't do the programming language, it's not like you can't go to the next module. So it's very modular in that front. So why I chose Golang versus Python, I think I made that quite clear around. So Kasten K10 and the open source projects are written in Go. But then, interesting enough, like some of these cloud natives, if you've heard of Docker and Kubernetes, they're also written in Go, as well as Prometheus and Grafana down that other end. And some of the characteristics, maybe it's a versus Python as well, but I have nothing really against that. That was the reason why I wanted to learn a bit more. The fundamentals of Golang as a language. Go is a compiled programming language. Go compiles directly into machine code. And what that means is that I could basically use a Linux laptop, I could use a Mac, I could use a Windows, and I can create a binary for Windows. Like I can create it for any architecture, regardless of the one I'm on. So it will compile for any architecture on one machine. Whereas with other programming language, you might actually need an ARM processor, or you need a Mac OS, or you need a Windows to be able to compile that programming language. And goes really relatively quick to make that compile happen. Linux-wise, kind of a similar story here. Like I imagine all of us have played or work with Linux on a daily basis. Again, it goes back to that Linux, the networking, the operating system, the fundamentals of infrastructure. But Linux already shares, and if not, like I would say that Linux is a fundamental part of what DevOps is from a principle and process point of view. So they have very similar cultures. They're both very much focused on scalability and customization. And if we think about, again, you'll see some familiar logos down the bottom here. Those tools generally start on a Linux-based architecture before then being ported potentially to Windows, Mac OS, where possible. Also, a nod there, and this is a new world for me, and I didn't really cover open source as a topic. I think that might be in the next committed 90 days, is that open source is a whole new world as well to go and look at and understand some of the projects that are there that enable us to do things and automate things a little bit better. So, but they generally, again, they start with that Linux mindset around that. Same with containers. Containers generally run on Linux, on an abstraction of a Linux OS. So getting started, if you want to learn something, and I left this slide in as an extra slide as well for Linux in particular, but I think this goes for all of the topics within the repository. If you want to learn something, then you have to get hands-on with it daily. I think we could all probably agree with that. So my challenge would be go and use that on a daily basis. Convert a laptop, convert a VM, use that on a daily. Try and get your work done on that. You'll dramatically learn a lot more around the fundamentals of Linux if you're on it every day. DevOps and networking, again, OSI layer, get an understanding of that. I do some stuff with Python in here as well about automating that process. That seems quite fitting given that we're in San Francisco as well. From a cloud point of view, we've all seen this, but get a baseline understanding from an Azure point of view. So this is very much the big picture, but understand what we're looking at from if you're running a cloud-based infrastructure on premises, you leveraging infrastructure as service on your local machine, platform as a service. What does that mean? Databases as a service. Like, where does the abstraction layer lie on that? Git version control. Like, how many people are using Git on a daily basis? Because it's not just for code. It's not just for like open source projects. Like, I've started to use it for presentations, so that I've got a version for or a branch for different events that I'm manipulating for each one. Just start, because you're living and breathing using that version control system. One key takeaway is that version control isn't a backup on that, and I generally have that talk track when I'm talking to a developer-focused audience as well. Containers, like if you think about what that looks like, think about containers as the next binary. This is how we're going to install our applications. Container orchestration, Kubernetes, but there are others. This is how we're going to orchestrate those. Think about this as the vCenter for your containers as such, without getting into the weeds about what Kubernetes is. Yeah, that was me trying to be funny. These containers are pods, but they're being orchestrated by a control plane. Again, very similar to what we see in vCenter. Infrastructure as code, humans make mistakes, let's automate that. Let's create what we want. This is what I want in code. Go away and deploy that wherever I want that to be. You can feel that I'm rattling through these pretty quick. Configuration management, so how do we maintain the application, the state of the application, and the systems that go with it. Ansible have the concept of playbooks. I want this to look like this, and I want to just make sure that it's always like that, so I can run this playbook on a continual loop to make sure that everything stays the same. CI/CD pipelines. Now, I think this is probably the most confusing one. because CI/CD pipelines don't necessarily mean that they need to be together. You can have a continuous integration system if you're a software developer, and a continuous delivery system or a deployment system if you're deploying out into an environment. So you can have two different systems for that. Observability, keeping a close eye on everything. We do this already today, right, in our virtual infrastructure. We need to do that across, and how do we automate that? And then data management, no different when it comes to Kubernetes. Any platform, there's no magic button. We still need to protect that workload. My biggest ask for you, if you go and have a look at that repository, is, well, what are we missing? I know there's a lot of security gaps in there, so I know that I'll be working on that. What's next? Some YouTube content, because not everyone wants to read. They consume from a video point of view, and we're already thinking about what that next lesson needs to look like. What does the next 90 days in 2023 look like? But I'll try and get ahead of the curve on that. There's the QR code. Please go and have a look, as well as the survey. Like, is this useful as a session? But hopefully this is as well, and like, you can see the contributors getting involved. Again, the reason why I do it is to, well, I imagine everyone on there, the reason why they do it is to, if it helps one person, it's worth sharing. And I think that's an important part of our community as we kind of have to go and traverse this potential new learning curve, right? I think with that, we're done. So hopefully that was useful. I'll be hanging around, so if there's any questions, shoot them over. But yeah, hopefully that was useful. Thank you.